Let's move on with the early perspectives on SLA in this segment as well. And the first approach in this regard is error analysis, which was probably the first approach which actually looked into the internal creative ability of learners. This largely happened because of dissatisfaction with contrastive analysis among various researchers. They found it too rigid to analyze the actual problems of the learners. So error analysis proposed by Corder focused on the actual problems or errors of the learners, and then focus shifted from the comparison of the languages to learners' actual sufferings. This is based on the description and analysis of learners' actual errors which they commit while writing or using a language. Let's look further. As I mentioned earlier, Corder was the first one to propose error analysis. And he and many people after that talked about the procedures of error analysis. One of the popular procedures comes to us from Alice in 1994. This includes various steps of error analysis. At the beginning is the availability of the samples or the collection of the samples. In order to do an error analysis of various people, a researcher would have to collect the samples of their writing or speaking if he or she wants to do research or error analysis on their speaking. Then the next stage is of identification of errors. What kind of errors are there in the samples? And in the next stage, we look into the description of errors that involves the classification of errors and also identifying that to which level of the language errors belong to. Is it related to the sounds or the syntax? This is identified at this stage. Then explanation of errors, why these errors might have happened, or were these errors interlingual or intralingual? Is it because of mixture of various languages, or is just the same language errors? At the end, the most important and the critical stage comes, which is evaluation of errors. This tells us that how critical the errors committed by the learners could possibly be. And a good researcher might also suggest some remedies in that regard as well. Error analysis do also have some shortcomings. We could see that there is ambiguity in the classification of errors. Various researchers might identify the same errors in different areas. So we still need to develop some uniform model in order to classify errors. And there is also a lack of positive data, because in error analysis we always look for learners' errors, and identifying errors may not possibly be the only way of teaching a language. This might demotivate some learners sometime. Then there is also a potential for avoidance in error analysis, because the learners might avoid certain errors which they usually commit while writing a sample for error analysis, or they avoid complex structures when they are using the language. So this is very much possible, and researchers have hinted about it. The next thought or approach about second language acquisition is interlanguage. Interlanguage is the intermediate grammar, or we could also call it interim grammar, between the passage of learning a second language. When learners start learning a second language, and before they reach the complete competence of that language, there is an intermediate state which might be called interlanguage. It's creative, and some people call it a third language, which is different from first and second language. Let's look at the next slide. If you look here, you could see on the extreme corners L1 and L2, and in the middle is the interlanguage. And as I said earlier, this is intermediate state. This has certain features. If you look on the left, you could see this is systematic. This is not abrupt. The interlanguage is governed by rules which constitute the learner's internal grammar. It's also dynamic. The rules of IEL keep changing, and they do so quite frequently, resulting in a succession of interim grammars, because learner is in the process of learning, so there is a possibility of changing. And the change shows that the learner is learning something. It's variable. Although the IEL is systematic, differences in context result in different patterns of language use. It do have reduced system, reduced form. Its form is less complex and also have reduced communicative functions. There is a possibility of fossilization in the process of the development of interlanguage. We could see that some researchers, some learners might cease to learn few components of a language which are essential in learning, and such process would be called fossilization. There are some other approaches, morpheme order studies, which looks into the natural order or universal sequence of learning, and this could possibly be helpful in designing material for second language teaching and for other inquiries as well. We also have a monitor model coming from Creation in 1978. It was also a very popular model based on certain hypotheses. One of these hypotheses is acquisition and learning hypothesis. Creation actually distinguished between learning and hypothesis. He thought learning and acquisition. He thought acquisition is more natural and learning is more formal and unnatural. He also talked about monitor hypothesis and thought whatever is learned is available only as a monitor to see that what has already been learned is at par with it or not, just to have an assessment of the already available knowledge with the learner. And he also talks about natural order hypothesis, which I have already mentioned. He talks about input hypothesis, that a comprehensible input could produce good learning and output. And in the end, he talks about affective filter hypothesis. That means that if there would be any affective filter working in the process of learning, the learning might not happen or might not be satisfactory. So, a learner's affective elements should also be kept in mind by the teachers while teaching a second language.